In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen. Veni Sancti Spiritus repletuorum correre fidelium et tui amoris rei signum accende, imite Spiritum et tuum et crebuuntur.
Et renovabis faciem terra.
Oremus Deus qui correre fidelium Sancti Spiritus illustratione covisti, de nobis seniorem spiritu recta sapere et de eius semper consolatione godere per Christum Dominum nostrum. Sed sapientiae. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen. Copy of each one of these. The mailboxes that you copied for each one is missing. All right. So, on page 15, at the bottom of the left-hand column, just concluding this pontificate of Nicholas II. All right, so pontificate of Pope Stephen X didn't last very long. There's not too much to say. Notice that Pope Stephen X required all ecclesiastics who are convicted of having violated the laws of clerical celibacy to be deposed from their functions. And that is the correct way to deal with that. In fact, the only way. It's the only way to send a strong enough message that that will not be tolerated. Just look at all the huge problems in the Novus Ordo, and even in SSPX, the Novus Ordo wannabe group that they are, have a very similar problem. That it's just, unfortunately, a fact of human nature that there are, fallen human nature, that is, that there are going to be some people who do that sort of thing. In any large organization, there are going to be some people who misbehave in heinous ways. It's unfortunate. Most of the time, if things are ordered, it'll be a very tiny percentage, but there will still be some. And everybody else has to be kept in order, kept in line. And one of those ways of keeping everybody else in line is to treat those who misbehave in these ways in such a way that says that this will not be tolerated. Don't even think about it. There will be zero tolerance for that. And the maximum severity will be used in every case, with zero hesitation. That's the only way to make sure that as many people as possible behave themselves. It's not the only, the only way. It's one of the ways that must be employed. There are other ways, of course, that must be employed as well, but that one is indispensable. That it will keep even those who might be so inclined, might keep at least some of them actually in line, when they see clearly that there will be no leeway for anybody who does that. And that needs to be clear to everybody at every turn. Certainly in our circles, that's I believe I make that pretty clear. So if it's even if it's the right kind of right kind of thing, wrong kind of the exactly illegal sort of horrible misbehavior, then we'd call the police personally on somebody who might be bad enough. If it's something the police would respond to, we would do that for sure, no question. It's the only thing. It's the full extent that we can't reduce anybody to the lay state these days. Obviously, you can say we will never look at your face again. We will never. We will call the police immediately. That much we can do, and we will if it comes to that ever. So the real question in all these things, yes, as we said, fallen human nature is fallen human nature, and even with the most diligent vetting process, the most diligent methods of formation, and so on and so forth, still some bad apples will get through the sifter, so to speak. It's just inevitable. In all things human, there are going to be certain defects. Even if they're not intentional, there will still be certain defects. And they just have to be dealt with correctly. So more than anything else, it's a question of leadership. How does the leadership respond to the bad apples? And when the leadership responds well, then the general percentage of problems is low. When leadership is bad, then it's a much worse problem. That's why whole dioceses in Novus Ordo, in some cases, might even be going bankrupt for covering up abuse cases. Because it gets discovered. There's a lot of it. There's a lot of that in the Novus Ordo. That's not even, say abuse, the illegal sort of behavior. We're not even talking about what might be consensual. There's probably a lot more of that than one might imagine. That's one thing that becomes clear. The more stories you hear about the Novus Ordo, people who come from the Novus Ordo, whether it be priests or anybody else, mostly people who are former Novus Ordo priests or even current Novus Ordo priests who talk to us, one thing comes clear at every turn. It becomes even clearer with every new story, and that is just as bad as you think things might be in the Novus Ordo, they're worse. Just imagine or don't imagine. Just how bad do you think things might be? Better not to imagine. The way just don't think about those things. But as bad as you might be inclined to think that they are, they're worse. It's even worse than you might imagine. There's no question about that. So there's the full extent of it. We might never know till Judgment Day, and maybe it's better we don't, because otherwise you might die of shock. But it's just very, very bad. And clearly the leadership, such as it is, I'm going to use that term in the loosest possible sense, of course, the leadership, such as it is not only not bringing it to heel, they're covering it up. Hence the lawsuits. So this is how a real pope deals with something like that. Just you're zero if you do something like that. And notice, just violating laws of clerical celibacy, that's not even talking about sins of child abuse or anything like that. This is just someone living in concubinage, which is a lesser evil. It's still a great evil, tremendous scandal. Not to minimize that at all, but there is, in a sense, a hierarchy of gravity of sin. There are degrees of gravity of sin, maybe is a better way to put that. And that's a lesser evil, still a grave evil, still a mortal sin, obviously, and a public scandal, but of a lesser degree than other sins. And even just that, just any violation of clerical celibacy of whatever nature, whether it be according to nature or not, whether it be in a particularly heinous way or not, still deposed from functions immediately. And in a perfect world, as it doesn't go into the details of it here, we're focusing on the ecclesiastical side of things, but in a perfect world, first the church would put such an errant cleric on trial, and then reduce him, and if he were to be deemed guilty, then reduced to the lay state, and then handed over as a layman thereafter to the state for prosecution of those actions as crimes against the state. And then whatever the civil punishment might be, the state is free to inflict that. Or that's the correct order. At first, the church would put the cleric on trial as a cleric, and then once he's legally speaking no longer a cleric, then he can be tried by the state. And the state will take its course, whatever that might be. So the Pope obliged them to break off their criminal relations, subjected them to public penance, and pronounced them incapable of celebrating the sacred mysteries, which means, of course, the Mass. Perhaps other ceremonies connected to it, and other ceremonies of the sacred liturgy, of the public prayer of the church, but the sacred mysteries means the Mass. So effectively incapable. Obviously, nothing can ever remove, as you know, nothing can remove the indelible character of the priesthood imprinted on the soul by the sacrament of holy orders. But it is possible that the authority of the church say that you are forbidden to exercise those orders to the extent, with very rare exception, to the same extent as though you had never been ordained in the first place. The authority of the church can do that, and in that sense, make someone incapable of doing it licitly, without committing grave sin. There might be some exceptions if somebody is about to die. Even a laicized priest could still validly, and not only validly, but licitly absolve. Or still, the requirement of being in the state of grace for administering any sacrament is still there. But in principle, even someone who is has been effectively stripped of the priesthood, can still exercise it. As long as he received it validly in the first place, can still exercise it under. It's very, very restricted. There are only very few cases in which that could ever be licit, but there are cases. Such cases are not beyond the realm of possibility by any means. That's what we mean by incapable. Right, so notice here a schism of Benedict X, that according to the most probable opinion, Benedict X was an anti-pope, but since his name appears in the Diario Romano, and as his successors of the same name have styled themselves, Benedict XI, XII, etc., we have given him his chronological rank. So not really a pope, seems at all, actually, but his insertion threw off the numbering system, so take note of that. Right, so pontificate of Nicholas II, no real pope here, of course. In the month of April of 1059, he held a council of 113 bishops at Rome, in which he said that he addressed the disorders following the death of Stephen X, referring to the schism of Benedict X, or so-called Benedict X. Typically referred to anti-popes not by their supposed papal names, but in this case we are, just because of the fact that his insertion threw off the system, the numbering system. So the Holy See became the prey of unworthy simoniacs, and the Church herself seemed for a moment in danger. So emphasis on seemed, obviously, because the Church could never be extinguished, in fact. Which is why I can only think that we're in, somebody said that once, I forget who it was, I don't think it was anybody of particular authority, but it would seem that were it not for the fact, obviously we know the Church is divinely protected, you'd think that Vatican II would have ended it. Of course, that's not possible, in fact. It has not been, it could never happen. But humanly speaking, you would think so, were it not for those divine promises. Just that's how bad things are. So to prevent any similar abuse in future, we decree, according to the authority of the fathers, that at the death of the Pope, the cardinal bishops shall first treat of the election, after which the cardinal priests may be called in, and it shall finally be submitted to the consent of the other clergy and of the people. The choice shall be made from within the bosom of the Roman Church, if a worthy subject be found. If not, he may be taken from another church. So the solemn decree was signed by all the bishops present. It clearly defined 2 points of considerable importance, which had hitherto remained vague and undecided: the exclusive reservation of the pontifical elections to the College of Cardinals, and the right of confirmation that could be exercised by the emperors. So it's actually debated whether the College of Cardinals is a divine institution or not. There are different opinions about it. Certainly in the earliest centuries of the Church, there was nothing called the College of Cardinals, but those who are in favor of the opinion that it's divinely instituted are in some way, and it seems that, I've never actually read any author who's talked about it, but it would seem that must be the contention, if you're saying that is somehow essential to the Church, which is what some authors seem to think. But from what I've heard, I've now come across an author who actually says that. But it's those who are in favor of that say that it already existed, it always existed quod substantiam, with regard to the substance in itself, in its essence, from the beginning of the Church, whether or not there was any group called that. Whoever were the immediate assistants of the Pope, of the College of Cardinals, in substance, if not in name necessarily. So there are also mention of it. Our author gives a little bit more of an explanation as to what the cardinals are exactly here. But they are really, in a sense, almost you can think of them as the Senate of the Church, almost. I mean, they can't take away from the power of the Pope. It's not like, say, in this country, in which case you need the president and the Congress, which includes the House and the Senate, to pass a law. It's not that. It's just that they are the Senate of the Church in the sense of being the immediate assistants of the Pope. And certainly they are second in rank in the Church only to the Pope himself. That much is true. Now, there is a hierarchy amongst them, as we saw reference to cardinal bishops, cardinal priests, cardinal deacons. And those are obviously the cardinal bishops being the most senior, priests, then the cardinal deacons. A priest could be a bishop. That's just the title of the church. Cardinal deacon could also be a bishop. But prior to John the 23rd, not all cardinals were bishops. For example, Cardinal Bio was never a bishop. And in a rare instance of a resignation of the cardinalate, he did in fact resign the cardinalate at a certain point and went back to being just a regular Jesuit priest after that. So not every cardinal was a bishop. That was started with John the 23rd, and that's why actually Cardinal Taviani had to be the famous, relatively, well, not strong enough conservative, but the famous conservative at Vatican II, was consecrated a bishop once John the 23rd came in because of that. So he had not been a bishop up to that point. And it's probably for all the wrong reasons that John the 23rd enacted that, and whenever since he enacted it, not being a true pope, of course. But there are instances of, at least under Pius IX, Cardinal Antonelli, who was Pius IX's Secretary of State, who led not exactly the most exemplary life, but it seems he was ordained a deacon probably just to be made a cardinal, so he could be Secretary of State because he was very good at that kind of thing, very good administrator. But the Pope can allow that. Obviously, it's not the ordinary way of things in the Church. Ordinarily, a man is not ordained a deacon unless he's going to become a priest. That's just the current discipline of the Church. But a Pope could allow otherwise, of course. And the point is that to be a cardinal deacon, one has to be at least a deacon. To be a cardinal priest, one has to be at least a priest. Cardinal bishop, of course, one has to actually be a bishop, in power of orders, that is to say. But a bishop could be any one of those three. A priest could be a cardinal deacon, and you see how that works. So there is a hierarchy there is an order of seniority even amongst the cardinals themselves. So, the preponderance given to the cardinals, as already established by St. Leo IX, rescued the elections from the multiplied influences which might bear upon the clergy from popular outbreaks or from the interference of secular princes. The cardinals thus constituted a great and powerful institution which secured the dignity and independence of the papal power. So it seems that even until, we mentioned it before, but all the way up to the early 20th century, that there was still some kind of a veto power that it wasn't the Holy Roman Emperor at that point, but the Austrian Emperor, as the successor to the Holy Roman Emperors, still had. That had not been exercised in a long time, but Emperor Franz Joseph tried to, well, he did. He asserted that in vetoing Cardinal Rampolla in the 1903 conclave, resulting in the election of St. Pius X. That it was considered doubtful whether or not the emperor actually had that. It was just a question. Yes, the privileges of the Holy Roman Emperor, which the position of Holy Roman Emperor being officially abolished in 1805, the privileges of the Holy Roman Emperor had been transferred to the Austrian Emperor, but the question was that one included? Is that certainly included? It probably wasn't explicit. There was some question about it. In any case, the attempt was made, and after that, nobody is going to vote for somebody who's been vetoed in any kind of a plausible way. And it certainly had some plausibility to it. And nobody wants to be the cause of the Great Western Schism 2.0, so to speak. And so nobody's going to vote for a candidate against whose election there might be any kind of an objection. Pretty much at all. Yes, convalidation is a thing, universal peaceful acceptance is a thing, but even so, there's still some ground for objection. Nobody wants to allow that. So whether or not he had the power is really a separate question from the fact that effectively he was vetoed. In the sense that nobody was going to vote for him after that. Whether or not that was due to a privilege granted to him by the church, or just because there was too much of a question mark after that, effectively he was vetoed. But see, this isn't always, as our author makes reference to here, these things aren't always as clear as we might like them to be. And there might be a whole host of reasons why that's the case. Sometimes somebody would get upset if something were to be changed too clearly, for example. And so they just try to keep things calm. Let's not change things so that the emperor gets upset. And maybe do it quietly, but maybe not, and maybe that gets lost, slips through the cracks, whether or not that actually happened. Such things can happen for other extrinsic considerations. That sometimes has to be cleared up later on once those considerations no longer obtain. But it's really, the idea is that the church carries out the election of the Pope. The state really shouldn't be involved in that. Any involvement of the state is for other reasons. That because the Roman mob is too much of a troublemaker, too much of a source of trouble and rioting, and pressure on the conclave, or just there's a deadlock in the conclave or something like that. Nobody can decide. So okay, bring in the emperor. Okay, whom should we turn to? All right, and we'll ask the emperor what he thinks and go abide by what he says. Something like that. That has happened before, actually, that sometimes someone's been elected who wasn't even in the conclave at all, wasn't a cardinal. A hermit might get elected just because they can't decide. The cardinals can't decide on the cardinals. Okay, he has a reputation of Sanky, let's just vote for him. Okay, good idea. That's happened. So it's not, typically that doesn't result in a very good papacy. It might be a saint, but not every saint is well equipped to be a ruler. Like you might have a monk in a monastery who is saintly and gets canonized ultimately, but who's a monk and has the characteristics that make him inclined to contemplative religious life, not to governing the billions of people who make up the Catholic Church as a whole. Not every saint has the gifts of every other saint. Now, there are plenty of popes, very good popes who have been canonized, but they clearly have those gifts to make them good rulers. Gifts in every sense. Whereas not everybody has those. It just isn't the case. Okay, so the cardinals thus constituted a great and powerful institution which secured the dignity and independence of the papal power. Like most other institutions, it rose from a weak and obscure beginning. The name of cardinal, which comes from cardo, so it refers to a hinge, like it's on a door. Things that a door swings on, a hinge. That's what a cardo is. So the idea being that they are we said it before, the senate of the church. In some sense, the hinges on which the whole church swings. That they are of assistance to the Pope in governing the church. In fact, there are some Roman congregations of which a cardinal has to be the head by canon law, which is to say by the will of the Pope. That a cardinal has to be the head of various different congregations that help to govern the church. So the name of cardinal, coming from cardo, was once common to all bishops, priests, and titulary deacons. Titulary, notice, referring to cardinal priests, cardinal deacons, cardinal bishops, and what the titles of different cardinals are. The idea is that the cardinals are all assigned to different churches in Rome. This cardinal has a title to this church, this cardinal title of that church, and so on and so forth. That's the idea. They are the chief clergy of Rome itself. In fact, they have to have the permission of the Pope not to live in the city of Rome itself. Now, some do, even on a habitual basis. For example, Cardinal Archbishop of Paris or of New York, Cardinal Spellman was a Cardinal Archbishop of New York. Obviously, he lived and reigned from New York ordinarily. Or who have various cardinal archbishops of Milan. The more important the see, also, the more likely it would be a cardinal who would be assigned to be the bishop of it. So typically, Milan had a cardinal archbishop, Venice, Paris, Westminster, the chief see of England, New York, and so on and so forth. The very prominent cities would have cardinals typically assigned to be their bishops, to be the primate of that nation, the chief ecclesiastic in that nation, usually. In fact, well, it's hard to say anybody could. I might have multiple cardinals in the same nation, but still, one of them would be the primate, the chief ecclesiastic, the ranking member of the church in that country. And so if they would have permission to live in those cities and to function as the bishops of those cities, of those dioceses. But even so, they had to. There are all these rules. Something to look at in canon law, mainly just for historical reasons. It doesn't apply today, obviously. But even so, those are rules that cardinals themselves have to follow. But they have to go to Rome every so often to see the Pope personally. The idea is that they are really assigned to Rome itself. And they have to go, even if they have permission to live elsewhere, they still have to go back to Rome every once in a while, to the city where they really are supposed to be, ideally. So notice that we had a reference to that earlier, that first the cardinals were the ones who actually cast the votes, and then that's in the name, and then all the clergy and people of Rome all agreed to it. That's the idea, is that they are the chief clergy of Rome, representing all the other clergy of Rome, and Rome itself being a microcosm of the church, therefore the entire church being represented when the cardinals cast their votes for the new pope. Everybody else does eventually consent, obviously, if nothing else, when the Pope presents himself on the balcony of St. Peter's, the newly elected candidate, having accepted, presents himself. Yeah, everybody accepts him. Okay, then at that point, everybody in some way agrees. Yes.
So a lay person could not be made a cardinal? Like, they have to be an ecclesiastic?
Well, a pope can choose anybody he wants, but that person would have to be made ordained at least a deacon, have to receive tonsure, minor orders, subdiaconate, and diaconate at the very least, to be made a cardinal. The pope could choose someone who is can appoint you layman and say you're going to undergo all of that, but that's what would be in fact required of him.
And their clerical state has no bearing on their ability to elect.
That's something that's attached to the office of cardinal. So even if the ordination that they underwent for that purpose was invalid, then yeah, they could still vote, definitely. That's a separate thing from that power of orders, definitely. All right. So at the beginning of the 9th century, the 7 bishops nearest to Rome, or suburbicarii, received the title of cardinals in a more particular manner as assessors or counselors of the Holy See. So yes, there are a number of small dioceses around the city of Rome itself called the suburbicarian sees. And it is of those dioceses that the cardinal bishops are the ordinaries. And so they have that's in canon law, something you see when you study canon law, but they don't have to receive special permission to leave the city of Rome to go to those dioceses. The idea being that they're so close anyway that they can just go out there. But they're very small dioceses also. So the idea that they don't have too much responsibility as bishops of dioceses, and they can easily go back and forth from those sees to Rome itself to assist in the government of the church as a whole. So the decree of Nicholas II definitively assigned them the high rank that they now occupy. So these things became, obviously the College of Cardinals already existed before this, but it just became clearer with time just how exalted that is in the church, how exalted a position that is, or what exactly is expected of them, what they are to do in every respect, how they are to act, the rules that they have to follow, and so on and so forth. All of that becomes more and more clearly defined over time. So the clause relating to the right of confirmation possessed by the German emperors over the election of the sovereign pontiffs is not less remarkable. It evidently views the right as a free concession of the Holy See and requiring its extent before taking any effect whatever. So this would last for not quite another 1,000 years, but close to it in the grand scheme of things. I said until 1903. And St. Pius X put an end to that, for sure. There's no question of it after him. But also, that was the last election carried out in which there was an Austrian emperor. Or no, sorry, second to last. Benedict XV was elected in 1914. But that was the last one. So, and nobody could have foreseen it at the time, but the Austrian Empire was almost over at that point. And it didn't die a natural death. It was dismantled in the wake of World War I. But actually, it's interesting that you see in the Exultet, in the Missal for Holy Saturday, singing of the Exultet, they're still in the Missal, still printed in the Missal to this day, even ones that came along after World War I, but before Vatican II, that there's still a clause for the insertion of the name of the emperor, which was to be sung in the realms of the Austrian emperor. It's a decree of the SRC at a certain point say, obviously don't use that at all anymore, but it's still printed in the Missal. The idea the church doesn't like to, in a sense, let go of anything. That's not to be sung anywhere at this point. But it would have been sung, say, on Holy Saturday in various churches in Austria, or throughout the Austrian Empire, as you see on the map there, throughout the long reign of Franz Joseph. He was in power from, I forget the exact date, but at least the 1860s till 1916 when he died. I want to say 1868 or so he came into power first. Something like that. 1860s at some point, and then reigned until 1916. So a long reign. Not an especially good one in various ways. I mean, Austria gave he wasn't the strongest ruler, and the empire gave a lot of trouble to the church at that time. And so that was not good in that sense at all. But it did, on the positive side, they did hold the empire together well. It never helps to be on the losing side of a war, for your reputation. But this idea that the Austrian Empire was a prison of nations, that was this whole rotting thing that was about to fall apart anyway, was not the impression that anybody at the time had. In fact, even the mentions of people getting nostalgic for it after World War One, and that people were, while it was still around, people were in admiration of how well the Habsburg monarchy kept everything together in that empire. Just how many different ethnic groups there were in that empire, how many different languages, how different, how much they didn't like each other. Well, and that's typical in an empire. Lots of people, they all hate each other. But they hate the ruling monarchy. They hate the crown even more, so they get along amongst themselves. This is one of the advantages that an empire affords to the nations that are part of it. That they get along amongst themselves because they all have a common thing to hate. They shouldn't be hating it, but they do in fact. And they get along amongst themselves. But better than they otherwise would, anyway. And to this day, that part of the world is still a mess. The Balkans are still a mess. That's the area that the Austrian Empire was trying to expand into before World War One. So the Austrian Empire covered more areas than just the Balkans, but all the people in that living in that empire who disliked themselves one another very intensely at that time still do, and it hasn't changed. Right. So the Hildebrand was the confidential advisor of Nicholas II, and Hildebrand as the future Pope Saint Gregory VII. So he was clearly prominent in the church for a long time before he was pope. So while practicing under the various pontiffs, the exercise of the sovereign authority, that is Hildebrand's influence, stamped all their acts with that vastness and grandeur which characterized his own great mind. Though beset with many political occupations, Nicholas II never lost sight of the spiritual interests of Christendom, of which he was the supreme pastor. He had sent as apostolic legate to Milan Cardinal St. Peter Damian to further the reformation of morals and the restoration of ecclesiastical discipline. So this does happen. This is just the human side of the church. You see that time and again, that the things need to be tightened up. Discipline needs to be shored up a bit. The screws need to be tightened, as it were. That happens. Anything with a human element, that happens. So you see it then. You see it here now. We'll see it definitely in the 16th century when Martin Luther reared his head. It was a genuine need for reform in a disciplinary sense in the church. Things needed to be tightened up then. There were certain evils that Martin Luther seized upon, used them as pretext for attacking the church. Unless he was still dead wrong in what he did. But typically, that's just generally true. That people who go around spouting lies base their lies on some grain of truth, or some twisted truth in it. You can see that it happens all the time. Anytime you see any headlines, you see that there's probably some truth to this, but you always wonder what's the full story. So just yesterday or today, there's some big thing going on, I think, in Minnesota, and ICE just shot this poor woman or something, and it's heavily implied just shot some poor innocent person. According to the federal government, she was a violent protester trying to run over officers. That's why she was shot. And if that's true, then it sounds justified. But you just see, in this case, obviously the news media, very leftist, wanting to attack any kind of conservative in power. Now they're going to spin things to really tell lies. I mean, mislead people so badly that it could be chalked up to a lie. But there's still some grain of truth to it somewhere, maybe. And that's how lies, the most effective lies are those. And total fabrications can also gain traction for various reasons, but most often the most successful, in some sense, successful lies are those with some grain of truth. And that was definitely true of Martin Luther. There were plenty of grains of truth for him to seize upon. Now, he blew it all out of proportion, but there were some grains of truth there. And that's why it's wisest for the church not to allow the enemies of the church any grounds at all for accusation. That's why I'm talking about treating with severity clerics who err badly enough, who misbehave themselves in a sufficiently grievous manner, to leave as little ground for accusation as possible. And nothing could ever affect, obviously, the intrinsic holiness of the church. But a lot of people could still be led astray. Weaker souls could be turned away or fall away because of the failures of individuals. That shouldn't happen, but it still can and definitely does. And so then, for the sake of those, well, for the good of souls generally, and including those weaker souls, things have to be dealt with the way that they ought to be dealt with. That excessive leniency is not true mercy. Excessively rigorous justice can be an evil, certainly, but excessive leniency, mercy that goes too far and becomes just really excessive leniency can be a source also of tremendous evils. So the evils had taken deep root in that city, in Milan, and throughout the whole province of Lombardy. The archbishop was notoriously simoniacal. It was hard to find a single priest or ecclesiastic among his clergy who had not bought his office or dignity. And that's a deplorable state of affairs, obviously. All right, let's see here. So there are two men, Saint Ariel, deacon of Milan, who was martyred, and I have to check the spelling of that second name. Something seems not quite right about that. But they had the courage to declare themselves openly against the archbishop and his unworthy abettors. And so obviously this is not a case of recognize and resist, not in the sense that R&R people today use it. I mean, they recognize his authority, of course, but oppose themselves, made clear their opposition, their public opposition to his public sins. Obviously, nobody has the authority to commit simony. So that's not something he was authorized to do. They're not resisting his acts of authority, they're resisting his public sins. Public sins committed by someone in possession of authority is the correct way to see that. So the scandal had obtained so firm a footing that the clergy, far from blushing at their disorders, openly preached against the law of ecclesiastical celibacy, thus renewing the ancient error of the Nicolaites. So this name, said St. Peter Damian, is given to scandalous clerics who seek a warrant for their infamous disorders in the scripture, so sacred scripture and the fathers, for vice becomes a heresy when supported by a distorted dogma. And that is typical. People who are addicted to vice will try to find some justification for it. Yeah, Martin Luther, Exhibit A. That's precisely what he did. Addicted to certain sins and tried to find excuses for it. Saying, oh, I just can't even help it. Sometimes the devil rides me, I'm like a horse, he said. Sometimes the devil rides me, or I think he used a donkey, which the aptness of that analogy is fitting, but not in the sense of which he meant it. But he said that sometimes God rides me, sometimes the devil. Just can't really help it. And that's wrong, obviously. Nobody's ever constrained to sin. Ever. Otherwise, God would not hold anybody accountable for it, of course. That's just one of the excuses that he made. There's a whole list. You have that in, I think it's the Modern Errors course, the historical part of the Modern Errors. Whole list of quotes of Martin Luther that were expunged from his works when they were translated from German to English because they were so scandalous, so shocking that even people translate, okay, that's a little too much. Get rid of that. But if you go to the original German works, apparently, you can still find them. If you know German, probably older German, and you can find them. There's somebody who went through all those books, Martin Luther's works, and found all those quotes. Someone who's an expert in German went through them, found those quotes, and translated them to English. So we still have them. But even if you won't find them in the usual translations of those works. That's how bad it is. I don't know of anybody who really admires Martin Luther in his personal life. And even Lutherans would probably say he went too far in certain ways, that he was a little excessive. Even if they might see cause for admiration in opposing the church or various things. Most would admit, I think, at least anybody who knows anything about his life, which are probably very few anyway, But those who be anyone confronted with the actual facts of his life would probably say that wasn't great. Maybe. I mean, in times past, I imagine. Today, maybe not. But in times past, probably. I mean, because it's so obviously disgusting. So many things he said and did. So that's coming down the line. But Martin Luther's a character you constantly go back to because he is case in point of so many things. His influence is so huge that someone who needs to be studied and understood thoroughly. In order to, to a great extent, just to understand why things are the way they are today. You have to know and understand a lot about Martin Luther. So the scandal had obtained so firm a footing, I already said that, at the risk of his life, the heroic legate, St. Peter Damian, succeeded in utterly rooting out the two evils which ravaged this desolated church. Meaning this diocese which in many ways was in shambles. So the Archbishop humbled himself before the representative of the Holy See, confessed his crimes, and deserved, by the humility of his avowal and the sincerity of his repentance, to retain his pastoral charge. So, obviously, someone who was publicly simoniacal should be deposed, but apparently his repentance was so complete and deemed so sincere that he was allowed to retain, and which the authority of the church can allow. If he had done enough to disown the scandal that he caused, then he can be retained. So there were instances of even, I think it was Leo XIII, allowing a bishop who had been consecrated in schism to actually become a legitimate bishop of his diocese. Probably to bring people, or either, it's probably to bring that area back into the church, bring it out of schism. And the authority of the church can do that. It may or may not always be a good idea, but it can be done. I said, in some cases, it's had bad effects. We mentioned if you've heard of the Petite Église that took place in the wake of the French Revolution. So what happened during the French Revolution was, I think I've explained it before. And remember that the Petite Église, it's just a good thing to know. If not, it's okay. We'll go through it again. That during the French Revolution, obviously, France, largely, a huge portion of the clergy in France went into schism. It went along with the formation of what was called the Constitutional Church, which is a schismatic sect. That was the idea, it would be the national church of France, but it was a schismatic sect. And so, famously, Talleyrand, who was a Freemason, and whom Napoleon, he had a name for him that you can't repeat it explicitly, you can't repeat it word for word, but essentially called him excrement in silk stockings, because he disliked him that much. But anyway, he consecrated a bunch of bishops for this constitutional church, and then abandoned the priesthood after that, tried to get married. But after at a certain point, a certain lull in the revolution, when the constitutional church was put an end to, that schismatic sect was brought to an end. There was a reconciliation under Pius VII. At a certain point, in order to come up with a concordat between the church and the state, the revolutionary France, the French revolutionary government demanded that former constitutional bishops be recognized by the Holy See as bishops of different dioceses. And Pius VII didn't like that, but he agreed to it, seeing it as that's what we saw it was as a way to achieve peace in France for the church. He, at a certain point, he removed from their dioceses former loyal bishops who had not gone along with the constitutional church. He removed them from their dioceses and put in their place former schismatic bishops who had been consecrated in schism. He put them in their places. And when those formerly loyal bishops were so upset at that they ceased to be loyal at that point, refused to vacate their dioceses, and went into schism, formed their own little schismatic sect. So, yeah, that was not justified, obviously. Nothing could justify schism. But that's the point being that absolutely speaking, Pius VII could do that. That was, in fact, done. Those other bishops, formerly loyal bishops, were, in fact, removed, and formerly constitutional, schismatic bishops were, in fact, put in their places in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And the Pope can do that if he wants to. And he did want to then. You could argue that was not a good idea, but that was a long time ago, too late to do anything about it now. So that happened, and that begot another schism. A smaller one. Petite Église means the little church. But that was just another schismatic sect. It didn't last very long, but it did come into existence. So you can argue that that was a bad idea, but one way or the other, good or not, it had that unintended evil effect. It was the occasion of that. Not the cause, but the occasion. Don't confuse the cause and occasion. A cause flows into the effect, an occasion does not. The occasion are the circumstances under which something happens. Sometimes there's a certain connection between an occasion and the thing that happens, the event, the cause, the effect of some cause. And sometimes it's a conditions, or a conditio sine qua non, as it's called, a condition without which not, literally. Without which the thing would not happen, the effect would not actually take place. So, the most obvious example is that the definition of the church is the conditio sine qua non of the assent of the faithful. In other words, that God reveals, that is the motive of that by the virtue of faith that we believe the truths that God has revealed. But the condition of our knowing that God has revealed them is the proposition of the Catholic Church of those different beliefs, of those different doctrines. So that's the condition, not the cause, but the condition. The condition without which there would not be a consent. As St. Augustine said, I would not believe the Gospels themselves were it not for the fact that the Catholic Church has defined that they are divinely inspired. So, again, conditio sine qua non. All right, so the guilty clerics were subjected to various canonical penances, as ought to be the case. St. Peter Damian, work on the elevator. St. Peter Damian, terrified at the sight of the vices which ruled the age, earnestly entreated the Pope to set him at liberty, that he might throw off the Roman purple, meaning so purple. That's sometimes it seems to be a term that's used generally. Obviously, cardinals wear red. Sometimes it's still referred to as the purple. It seems to just be a general reference to color indicating high dignity. The purple is the royal color. So it's when we refer to the color purple of vestments, it seems it's technically violet. The color purple is used you say it all the time, and that's fine. But purple is more of a royal color, and violet is the penitential color. Technically, it seems there's a difference. But the purple meaning the cardinalatial garb. So you want to throw off the Roman purple and return once more to his beloved retreat in the holy shades of Monte Cassino. So the original Benedictine monastery. But this is something that often happens in lives of the saints, that there's not a struggle necessarily, or not properly so called, but something like it between the saint and the personal desires of the saint and what is clearly the will of God for the saint. What divine providence has clearly decreed that saint should actually do during his earthly life. And sometimes of course, it's not a true struggle, and a certain struggle, but between the saint and his own desires more than anything else, because it's part of one of the things that we admire about their lives, obviously, is that they overcame the urge to do what they wanted to do and instead submitted themselves to what was clearly the will of divine providence. In this case, St. Peter Damian just wants to stop being a cardinal and just go back to being a contemplative religious, but that's clearly not what the popes are telling him. No, we need you. And that, of course, is a clear indication of what the will of God actually is, or was for him. But the church, we have that here, but the church too sadly felt the dearth, so a lack, of upright hearts and strong minds to give up the help of so strong an auxiliary. The minority of Henry IV was a time of anarchy and disorder in Germany. So the minority, this is a fairly common phenomenon in hereditary monarchies, in case in which, say, a monarch dies and his oldest son, who is meant to be his heir, is too young to rule. Like maybe just be a little kid and and so clearly unable to exercise the authority that he's supposed to have. And so in that minority, oftentimes there's a regency, someone else who actually takes the reins of government in that time. And it happens fairly frequently, you see throughout history, that the regent doesn't want to give up power. Once the monarch, the one who's supposed to have the authority, comes to the right age to exercise his power, that the regent doesn't want to give up that authority, doesn't want to give up the power. That happens sometimes. But in this case, it seems there wasn't anybody at all exercising authority, because I have, mentioning anarchy. And that, anarchy, the letter A in Greek by itself as a preposition means without. And the archy refers to a government, so it means no government. So an anarchist is somebody who is opposed to all government, all authority. And that's obviously those people are dead wrong in being so opposed, but referring to a time of anarchy just means a time in which there is no government, or at least in practice, nobody is exercising authority for whatever reason. So you can see obviously very clearly how disorder would arise from that. And we'll continue with all that next time. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen. Subituum presidium confugimus Sancta Dei Genitrix, nostras peccatinis et dispicias in necessitatibus, stera periclis cunctis libera nos semper, Filii gloriosa benedicta. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen.